Some dogs wag their tails at everyone. But once in a while, a dog looks at one specific person like it already made a decision before a single word was spoken. The German Shepherd had been at the rescue center for 7 months, and during those 7 months, nobody could get close to him for more than a few seconds. Families came in every weekend hoping to adopt. Some brought treats. Some crouched down with soft voices and patient smiles. A few even sat on the cold concrete floor for nearly an hour trying to earn his trust. But the dog always reacted the same way. He stayed against the far wall, completely silent, watching every movement with those dark alert eyes that made people uncomfortable after too long. He never barked. Never lunged. Never caused trouble. That almost made it stranger. The volunteers started calling him Ghost because he moved around the shelter without making a sound, like he was there physically but somewhere else emotionally. One volunteer said the dog acted like he was waiting for someone. Not hoping. Waiting. By the 8th month, people stopped asking about him altogether. Most visitors walked past his enclosure after reading the note clipped beside the gate. Requires experienced owner. Extremely selective with trust. Selective. That was the word everyone used. But nobody really understood what it meant until Ethan Carter walked through the front door on a rainy Thursday afternoon in late October. Ethan didn't come there looking for a German Shepherd. Honestly, he wasn't even sure why he came at all. His apartment felt too quiet lately, especially after the divorce. The silence in those rooms had started feeling heavier than furniture. He worked remotely, barely slept, and spent most nights eating takeout alone, while old sitcom reruns played in the background just to make the place feel less empty. A coworker had casually mentioned that getting a dog changed his life, and somehow that idea stayed in Ethan's mind longer than it should have. So there he was, standing in a shelter that smelled faintly like disinfectant and wet fur, hands shoved into the pockets of an old gray jacket, wondering if he should just leave before anyone talked to him. Then something strange happened. Before Ethan even reached the kennels, Ghost stood up. One of the volunteers noticed immediately because the dog almost never reacted to footsteps anymore. But this time, his ears lifted forward. His body became perfectly still. Not tense. Focused. Ethan kept walking without noticing him at first, passing cages filled with barking dogs desperate for attention. But Ghost didn't bark. He simply watched Ethan move through the room like he was recognizing something nobody else could see. And when Ethan finally stopped in front of the enclosure, the entire shelter seemed to go quiet for one impossible second. Because the dog who trusted nobody slowly walked toward the gate and sat down directly in front of him. The volunteer standing beside the enclosure actually took a step back because she had never seen Ghost approach someone that quickly before. "Do not move too fast," she said softly, almost instinctively, but Ethan was not trying to move at all. He just stood there staring at the dog sitting calmly on the other side of the gate. Up close, Ghost looked older than Ethan expected. There was gray beginning to show around his muzzle, and one of his ears carried a small notch like life had already taken pieces out of him long before the shelter did. But it was the way the dog looked at him that felt strange. Most dogs looked at people with excitement or curiosity. This was different. Ghost looked at Ethan like he was studying him. Quietly. Carefully. Almost cautiously hopeful. Ethan slowly crouched down, resting one arm against his knee. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. The dog did not wag his tail. He did not jump against the fence or demand attention the way the other dogs did. Instead, he lowered his head slightly and moved closer until his nose nearly touched Ethan's hand through the metal bars. The volunteer blinked twice like she was trying to make sure she was actually seeing it happen. "That is the closest he has gotten to anyone in months," she admitted. Ethan glanced at her. "Really?" She nodded slowly. "Usually he keeps his distance. Even with us." Ethan looked back at Ghost, unsure what to say after that. The truth was, he did not think of himself as someone animals naturally trusted. Growing up, his family never had pets because his father thought they were distractions. Later in life, work consumed most of his time anyway. Meetings. Deadlines. Flights. Long nights staring at spreadsheets under fluorescent office lights while his marriage slowly became something polite and empty. Somewhere along the way, Ethan had become the kind of person who stopped expecting warmth from anything. But Ghost kept staring at him with those steady dark eyes, and for some reason, Ethan could not look away. Animals notice things people ignore. The smallest shifts in breathing. The tension hidden in shoulders. The energy someone carries into a room. Studies have shown that dogs can detect stress hormones through scent alone, reading emotional states long before words are spoken. And standing there in that shelter, Ethan realized something uncomfortable. Ghost did not seem drawn to confidence or strength. He seemed drawn to familiarity. Like he recognized the exhaustion Ethan had spent years trying to hide from everyone else. The volunteer unlocked the outer gate carefully. "You can step inside if you want," she said. "Just let him come to you." Ethan hesitated for half a second before walking into the enclosure. The concrete floor felt cold beneath his shoes, and somewhere across the building another dog barked sharply before falling silent again. Ghost stayed exactly where he was, watching him. Then, after a long quiet moment, the German Shepherd crossed the remaining distance, and gently rested the side of his head against Ethan's leg like he had already made up his mind. Ethan had not planned on adopting a dog that day. In fact, even after Ghost rested his head against his leg, part of him still thought he should walk away before this became real. But something about the weight of that quiet gesture stopped him from moving. Dogs do not lean into people casually. Especially dogs that have spent months avoiding touch. Animal behaviorists often describe physical contact in cautious dogs as a calculated act of trust. It means the dog has decided, even briefly, that being vulnerable near you feels safer than staying guarded. And Ghost was doing exactly that. Ethan slowly lowered his hand onto the dog's neck, half expecting him to pull away. He did not. The German Shepherd closed his eyes for 1 second, almost like his entire body had been holding tension for too long, and finally found a reason to let go. The volunteer standing outside the enclosure shook her head softly. "I have never seen him do that before," she said. Ethan gave a small awkward laugh. "Maybe he is just having a good day." But deep down, he knew that was not true. Even people can sense when a moment means more than it should. 30 minutes later, Ethan found himself sitting in a tiny office near the front desk filling out adoption paperwork he never expected to sign. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the volunteer explained Ghost's history as carefully as possible. Nobody knew exactly where he came from. A couple found him wandering near a highway rest stop almost a year earlier. No collar. No microchip. No owner ever came looking for him. At first, the shelter assumed he would be adopted quickly because German Shepherds usually were. But every time someone showed interest, Ghost pulled away emotionally. Not aggressive. Not unstable. Just distant. Like he had already learned what happened when attachments disappeared. "Sometimes dogs carry emotional patterns longer than people realize," the volunteer explained quietly. "Especially intelligent ones." Ethan glanced through the office window toward Ghost lying silently near the hallway entrance. Even now, the dog kept looking in his direction every few seconds just to check where he was. That behavior meant something too. Dogs repeatedly monitor the location of individuals they feel emotionally connected to. Not because they are controlling. Because connection creates awareness. The people who matter become part of their internal map of safety. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest when he noticed it. It had been a long time since anybody seemed relieved just because he stayed in the same room. The drive home took nearly 40 minutes through wet streets and fading evening traffic. Ghost sat quietly in the back seat the entire time, never whining, never pacing, only lifting his head whenever Ethan glanced at him through the rearview mirror. And when they finally reached the apartment building, something happened that Ethan would remember for years afterward. He opened the back door expecting hesitation, but Ghost stepped out calmly, looked up at the building, then walked directly beside Ethan toward the entrance like he had already decided that wherever this man lived was home now. The first night felt unfamiliar to both of them. Ethan could sense it the moment he unlocked the apartment door and stepped inside with Ghost following closely behind him. The place was small for a German Shepherd, barely 900 square feet, with soft yellow kitchen lights and the faint smell of coffee that always seemed trapped in the walls no matter how many windows he opened. For years, the apartment had only been a place Ethan slept in between workdays. Quiet. Predictable. Emotionally empty. But now every movement suddenly mattered because another living creature was paying attention to all of it. Ghost entered slowly, paused silent against the hardwood floor as he carefully explored each room without touching anything. He checked corners first. Then windows. Then the hallway leading to Ethan's bedroom. Dogs instinctively map environments when entering unfamiliar territory. They identify exits, sounds, scent trails, and safe zones within minutes. Especially dogs that have spent long periods living in uncertainty. But what caught Ethan off guard was not Ghost's caution. It was the fact that the dog kept coming back to check on him after every few steps. Kitchen. Back to Ethan. Living room. Back to Ethan. Bedroom doorway. Back again. Like no room in the apartment mattered unless Ethan was inside it too. Most people misunderstand attachment in dogs. They assume loyalty comes from feeding schedules or dependence. But canine psychologists often explain that trust forms through emotional predictability. Dogs relax around nervous systems that feel stable. Around people whose energy says, without words, "You are safe here." And somehow, despite Ethan feeling emotionally lost for years, Ghost had already decided he was that person. Ethan filled a stainless steel water bowl and placed it near the kitchen wall, while Ghost sat nearby watching him carefully. Not begging. Not anxious. Just observing. There was something strangely human about the way the dog studied his routines, as if he was learning Ethan rather than simply living beside him. Later that night, Ethan microwaved leftover pasta and ate quietly on the couch while an old baseball game played softly on television. Every few minutes he glanced down expecting Ghost to be asleep somewhere across the room. But the dog stayed nearby the entire time, stretched across the rug with his head resting on his paws, eyes half open, always aware of where Ethan was. Research has shown that dogs bonded to humans often enter lighter sleep cycles when near the person they trust most. Part of their brain stays alert, monitoring movement, breathing, emotional changes. Not out of fear. Out of connection. Around midnight, Ethan stood up and turned off the television. The apartment instantly became silent except for distant rain tapping lightly against the windows. He walked toward the bedroom, then stopped suddenly when he realized Ghost had frozen too. The German Shepherd looked toward the dark hallway leading deeper into the apartment, but did not move forward. Ethan frowned slightly. "You okay?" he asked softly. Ghost looked back at him for a long second before slowly stepping closer until his shoulder brushed against Ethan's leg. It was subtle. Almost invisible. But Ethan understood the feeling immediately because he knew it himself. Sometimes when you have spent too long feeling alone, even safety can feel unfamiliar at first. Over the next few days, Ethan began noticing something unusual about the way Ghost behaved around him. It was not dramatic enough for most people to recognize, but once he saw it, he could not stop seeing it. The dog tracked his emotional state constantly. If Ethan stood up suddenly after reading an email from work, Ghost's ears immediately lifted. If Ethan paced around the apartment late at night unable to sleep, Ghost quietly followed a few feet behind without making a sound. And whenever Ethan sat down heavily on the couch with that distant exhausted look people get when their thoughts become too loud, Ghost always moved closer. Not demanding attention. Just nearby. Dogs are incredibly sensitive to emotional shifts in humans. Studies have shown they can detect changes in breathing patterns, muscle tension, cortisol levels, even subtle differences in scent produced by stress and sadness. But what makes dogs extraordinary is not simply that they notice those things. It is that many of them respond to them emotionally. And Ghost responded to Ethan constantly. On the fourth morning, Ethan woke up before sunrise after another restless night. The apartment was still dark except for pale blue light leaking through the blinds. For a moment he forgot the dog was there at all until he felt slow, steady breathing near the side of the bed. Ghost had fallen asleep on the floor beside him sometime during the night. Not across the room. Not near the bedroom door. Right beside him. Ethan stared quietly at the dog for several seconds, surprised by the strange heaviness building in his chest. It had been years since waking up beside another living thing felt comforting instead of complicated. Later that afternoon, Ethan took Ghost on a walk through a nearby park about half a mile from the apartment. Autumn leaves covered the sidewalks in shades of orange and dark red while cold wind pushed through the trees overhead. Ghost stayed close the entire time, occasionally stopping to sniff the air before continuing beside Ethan with calm, focused attention. Then something happened near the edge of the walking trail that Ethan did not fully understand. A jogger approaching from the opposite direction smiled politely and slowed down for a moment. "Beautiful dog," he said. Ethan smiled back awkwardly. "Thanks." But Ghost instantly shifted positions. Subtle. Controlled. He moved slightly in front of Ethan, body relaxed but alert, eyes carefully tracking the stranger until he passed. Then, just as quickly, Ghost relaxed again and continued walking normally. Protective behavior in dogs is often misunderstood. Truly bonded dogs do not constantly react with noise or aggression. In fact, the most emotionally stable dogs usually display protection quietly. They monitor distance, watch body language, position themselves strategically near the person they trust. Ghost was not trying to dominate the environment. He was making sure Ethan felt safe inside it. And somehow that realization affected Ethan more than he expected. Because the truth was, nobody had protected his peace in a very long time. That night, while making coffee in the kitchen, Ethan suddenly caught himself talking out loud to the dog about his day without even thinking about it. Work frustrations. Bills. The awkward silence after divorce papers get signed. The kind of thoughts he normally kept locked away because speaking them made them feel too real. Ghost sat nearby listening with quiet attention, head tilted slightly as though every word mattered. And maybe that was the moment everything truly started changing. Because loneliness does not always disappear when someone speaks to you. Sometimes it disappears when someone finally stays. By the second week, the apartment no longer felt like the same place Ethan had been living in for years. The silence was still there, but it had changed shape. Before Ghost, the quiet felt empty, like every room was waiting for something that never arrived. Now the quiet felt shared. Alive. Ethan started noticing small routines forming between them without either of them trying. Every morning around 6:30, Ghost would quietly walk to the side of Ethan's bed and wait. Not barking. Not pawing. Just sitting there patiently until Ethan opened his eyes. And the moment Ethan finally looked at him, the German Shepherd's tail would give one slow, deliberate wag, like he had been waiting all night for confirmation that Ethan was still there. Dogs are creatures of emotional rhythm. They build attachment through repeated moments of safety and predictability. Over time, those moments become more important to them than food, toys, or commands. And for Ghost, Ethan himself had quietly become the center of that rhythm. But the deeper their bond grew, the more Ethan began noticing something else too. Ghost never fully relaxed around anyone. Except him. It became obvious the first time Ethan's neighbor, Melissa, came over to return a package that had accidentally been delivered to her apartment downstairs. Melissa smiled warmly the second she saw Ghost lying near the couch. "Oh my God, he is beautiful," she said, stepping a little closer. Ghost immediately stood up. Not aggressively. Not fearfully. Just alert. His eyes stayed fixed on her, while his body shifted subtly between Melissa and Ethan. Ethan noticed how controlled the behavior was. No growling. No barking. Just quiet observation. Melissa laughed nervously. "Wow, he is really protective of you." Ethan looked down at Ghost, who still had not taken his eyes off her. "I think he is just cautious." But deep down, Ethan knew it was more than that. Ghost trusted him completely. Everyone else still had to earn permission to exist inside that circle. And strangely, Ethan understood that feeling better than he wanted to admit. Because after the divorce, he had done the exact same thing emotionally. He stopped letting people get too close. Stopped answering calls. Stopped making plans. The world became easier to handle from a distance. That weekend, Ethan took Ghost to a small pet supply store about 10 minutes away. The moment they walked inside, people noticed the German Shepherd immediately. Some smiled. Some asked questions. One little boy pointed excitedly from the shopping cart while his mother apologized. But through all of it, Ghost remained completely calm as long as Ethan stayed nearby. Then, near the checkout counter, Ethan made a simple mistake. He stepped away for less than 15 seconds to grab a forgotten bag of dog food from the end of the aisle. When he looked back, Ghost had risen to his feet instantly, scanning the store with visible tension until his eyes found Ethan again. And the second they did, his entire body relaxed. Scientists studying canine attachment compare this behavior to the way young children monitor a trusted parent in unfamiliar environments. The trusted figure becomes what researchers call a secure base. The emotional center that tells the nervous system whether the world feels safe or uncertain. Ghost was not simply attached to Ethan. He was emotionally anchored to him. That realization hit Ethan harder than he expected later that night, while sitting alone on the couch with Ghost asleep beside him. Somewhere along the way, this dog had stopped acting like a rescued animal, and started acting like someone who finally found the person he had been searching for all along. About 3 weeks after bringing Ghost home, Ethan received a phone call he had been avoiding for months. It happened late on a Tuesday evening while cold rain pressed softly against the apartment windows and Ghost slept near the couch beside him. The name on Ethan's phone made his stomach tighten immediately. Claire. His ex-wife. For a moment he considered letting the call go to voicemail like he usually did. But something about the silence in the apartment made avoidance feel heavier than answering. So he picked up. At first the conversation sounded polite. Careful. The kind of conversation two people have when they used to know each other deeply, and now only know how to speak around old pain instead of through it. Claire talked about paperwork still needing signatures. About forwarding mail. About practical things. But then her voice softened unexpectedly. "You sound different," she said quietly. Ethan looked down at Ghost, whose ears had already lifted the second tension entered Ethan's voice. "Different how?" he asked. There was a pause on the line. "Calmer," she admitted. Ethan did not know how to answer that because part of him had not realized it until that exact moment. Before Ghost, every evening felt emotionally loud even when the apartment was silent. His thoughts spiraled constantly. Regret. Failure. The exhausting replay of conversations that no longer mattered but still refused to leave his head. But now there was structure to his life again. Morning walks. Feeding routines. Quiet companionship. Another heartbeat in the room reminding him to stay present instead of drowning in the past. Claire spoke for another minute or two before eventually saying goodbye softly. The moment the call ended, Ethan exhaled deeply and leaned forward, elbows resting against his knees. And almost instantly, Ghost stood up. The German Shepherd crossed the room slowly and positioned himself directly in front of Ethan without making a sound. Then he gently pushed his head beneath Ethan's hand. Dogs are remarkably skilled at detecting emotional distress in humans. Researchers have found that many dogs respond differently to crying, anxious breathing, and elevated stress levels than they do to ordinary behavior. But what makes certain dogs extraordinary is not just detection. It is intention. Some dogs actively attempt to comfort. And Ghost was doing exactly that now. Ethan stared at him quietly before giving a tired laugh under his breath. "You always know, huh?" Ghost stayed there, completely still, eyes soft, waiting patiently until Ethan's breathing slowed again. Then something unexpected happened a few nights later that made Ethan understand the depth of the bond forming between them even more clearly. Around 2 a.m, Ethan woke suddenly from a nightmare he could not fully remember. His chest felt tight. His thoughts scattered. For several seconds he just sat there in the dark trying to steady himself, while rain tapped lightly against the bedroom window. And before Ethan even moved, Ghost was already awake. The dog climbed off the floor and carefully rested the front half of his body against the side of the bed, pressing close enough for Ethan to feel his warmth. No panic. No noise. Just quiet presence. Animal behavior experts sometimes describe this as emotional synchronization. Over time, bonded dogs begin responding instinctively to shifts in the emotional state of the humans they trust most. Their nervous systems adapt to each other. And lying there in the dark beside Ghost, Ethan realized something that unsettled him in the best possible way. This dog had not attached himself to Ethan because Ethan was strong, confident, or emotionally stable. Ghost chose him because somehow, without words, he understood exactly what it felt like to need someone who stayed. Winter arrived quietly that year. The mornings grew colder, the sidewalks stayed silver with frost until almost noon, and the trees outside Ethan's apartment slowly emptied until their branches looked thin and tired against the gray sky. But inside the apartment, life had begun feeling warmer in ways Ethan still struggled to explain. It showed up in small moments first. The way Ghost waited near the door every afternoon around 5 because he had memorized the sound of Ethan shutting down his work laptop. The way Ethan automatically reached down to scratch behind Ghost's ears while making coffee without even thinking about it anymore. The way silence no longer felt like abandonment when another living soul was breathing beside you. One Saturday evening, Ethan decided to drive out to a quiet lake nearly 30 miles outside the city. He used to go there years ago before life became complicated. Before the divorce. Before every day started feeling emotionally identical to the one before it. The lake was mostly empty that time of year except for a few fishermen bundled in heavy jackets near the far shoreline. Ghost stayed close as they walked along the water, occasionally pausing to sniff frozen grass poking through the thin layer of snow. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt his thoughts slow down. No replaying old conversations. No heavy pressure sitting behind his ribs. Just cold air, quiet water, and the steady sound of paws moving beside him. Then Ethan noticed something that made him stop walking entirely. Ghost was not exploring the lake the way most dogs would. He was watching Ethan. Constantly. Every few seconds the German Shepherd glanced back toward him as if checking one simple thing over and over again. "Are you okay?" Animal behavior researchers often explain that deeply bonded dogs become emotionally invested in the well-being of their chosen human. Not because they are trained to. Because attachment changes the way their brain prioritizes another living being. The trusted person becomes emotionally significant in the same way pack members once were in the wild. Their safety matters. Their emotions matter. Their absence matters. And standing there beside that frozen lake, Ethan realized Ghost had been asking him the same silent question every day since they met. Not where are we going? Not what are we doing next? Just are you okay? The realization hit harder than Ethan expected because the truthful answer for most of the past few years had been no. He had hidden it well from coworkers. From friends. Even from himself sometimes. But dogs do not evaluate people the way humans do. They do not care how successful you sound or how put together your life appears from the outside. They respond to emotional truth. And somehow Ghost saw Ethan more clearly than most people ever had. As the sun started disappearing behind the trees, Ethan sat down on a cold wooden bench near the shoreline while Ghost settled beside him. For several quiet minutes neither of them moved. Then Ethan finally spoke softly into the freezing air. "I think you saved me a little, buddy." Ghost immediately lifted his head at the sound of Ethan's voice and leaned gently against his side with slow, steady pressure. Not excitement. Not confusion. Just closeness. Like he understood enough. And maybe that was the most extraordinary part of all. Ghost never asked Ethan to become someone different before choosing him. He did not need Ethan to be fearless or outgoing or emotionally healed. The dog had looked directly at the lonely, exhausted version of Ethan standing inside that shelter months earlier and decided, without hesitation, that he was already enough. Spring arrived slowly after that winter, almost quietly. the way healing sometimes does. Ethan noticed it first during their morning walks when the air stopped hurting his lungs and small patches of green began pushing through the grass near the sidewalks. Ghost noticed it too. His pace became lighter. His ears stayed relaxed more often. And for the first time since coming home from the shelter, the German Shepherd started playing again. Really playing. One afternoon in early April, Ethan tossed the tennis ball across a small field near the park, expecting Ghost to ignore it the way he usually ignored toys. But this time the dog sprinted after it with sudden explosive energy before circling back toward Ethan with the ball held proudly in his mouth. Ethan actually laughed out loud, the kind of genuine laugh that escapes before you have time to control it. Ghost immediately froze for half a second, tail wagging slowly as if he had been waiting to hear that sound from Ethan all along. Dogs are deeply responsive to emotional reinforcement. They remember the tone of your voice, your facial expressions, the emotional atmosphere surrounding certain moments. And over time, many dogs begin actively seeking the behaviors that bring joy to the humans they love. Ghost was not just learning Ethan's routines anymore. He was learning Ethan's happiness. Weeks later, Ethan realized something else had changed too. He had started answering phone calls again. Returning messages. Accepting invitations he normally would have avoided. It was subtle at first. Coffee with an old friend. A longer conversation with his sister. Small things. But Ghost had quietly rebuilt structure around Ethan's life simply by needing him every day. Morning walks. Feeding times. Evening routines. Consistency. Purpose. There is a reason therapy dogs are used in emotional recovery programs across the country. Human beings regulate emotionally through connection more than they realize. And sometimes the safest form of connection is the one that asks for nothing except presence. One evening near sunset, Ethan sat on the apartment floor sorting through an old cardboard box filled with photographs he had avoided opening since the divorce. Ghost lay nearby watching him carefully while soft, orange light filled the room. Ethan picked up a picture from years earlier and stared at it quietly for a long time before finally shaking his head with a tired smile. "I thought losing all of that meant something was wrong with me," he admitted softly. Ghost lifted his head immediately at the sound of Ethan's voice. The German Shepherd walked over slowly and rested beside him, close enough that Ethan could feel the warmth of his body against his arm. No judgment. No expectations. Just quiet understanding. Ethan reached down absent-mindedly, fingers brushing through the thick fur around Ghost's neck. And sitting there on the apartment floor, he finally understood something that had taken him months to see clearly. Ghost never chose him because Ethan was the strongest person in the room. Or the happiest. Or the most confident. The dog chose him because dogs do not search for perfect people. They search for safe hearts. For honesty. For emotional consistency. For the person whose presence feels like home. Humans spend years trying to hide broken pieces from each other, pretending to be stronger than they are. But dogs do not care about performance.